The battlefield stretched like a sea of smoke and ash, the air filled with the screams of warriors and the clash of steel. The alien queen stood tall among her generals, her armor gleaming under the burning skies. She was known as a ruler who never accepted weakness, yet she enjoyed testing the courage of those who stood before her. That was why she smiled when the council presented a human to her. He was not a soldier, not a trained fighter, but a man who had never even held a sword. His hands looked rough from work, but not from war. His eyes showed fear, but also something else, something quiet and steady that made her pause for a moment before dismissing it. The queen's daughters laughed at him, mocking his stance as he struggled to hold the heavy blade she gave him. Around them stood alien champions, each one trained since birth to fight and win. They had scaled mountains, fought beasts, and killed enemies without hesitation. But this human looked like he did not belong. He was dressed in borrowed armor that did not fit his frame, and even the sword seemed ready to slip from his grasp. The queen raised her voice so that all could hear. She declared that this human would be paired with her most trusted commander. It was not an honor but a punishment, for she believed the human would fail and bring shame upon himself. The human's name was Elias. He said little, his voice quiet when he introduced himself. He stood surrounded by laughter and sharp words, yet he did not leave. He simply placed his hands tighter on the sword, as if gripping it gave him courage. The queen narrowed her eyes at him. She wanted to see him run, to see him break. But he did not. Something about his silence unsettled her, though she would never admit it. She turned her gaze back to the war front where their enemies gathered, in black waves across the horizon. The battle drums began to thunder and the army marched. When the clash came, the ground shook. The alien soldiers charged, blades flashing, shields breaking, voices raised in unison. Elias moved slower, unsure of his place, yet he followed. He stepped into the chaos with a pounding heart, his sword heavy in his hands. The first enemy came at him, tall and armored, with a spear aimed to pierce his chest. Elias stumbled, barely, lifting his sword in time, and the clash sent pain shooting up his arms. The crowd of soldiers around him jeered, some laughing even as they fought for their lives. To them he looked like a child lost in a storm. Yet Elias did not fall. He kept his feet on the dirt, teeth clenched as the spear pressed against his guard. The queen watched from a distance, her eyes sharp. She expected him to be torn apart, yet Elias twisted at the last second, using the weight of the sword not with skill, but with desperation. The blade swung wide, clumsy and uncontrolled, but it struck with force that surprised even him. The enemy fell with a cry, armor dented, weapon shattered from the blow. For a heartbeat, the battlefield seemed to freeze around him. Soldiers who mocked him stopped and stared. The queen herself leaned forward, her expression hard to read. That one strike, born not of training but of raw will, had shifted something in the air. Elias breathed heavily, his arms trembling, his heart racing, like a drum. He did not smile, did not boast, but his eyes lifted for a moment. The queen's gaze locked with his, and in that instant she felt the first ripple of doubt in her judgment. The weakest partner, the man who should have fallen in the first moment, had delivered a strike that none had expected. She whispered under her breath, almost too softly for anyone to hear, a single thought she could not ignore. Perhaps the human was not so weak after all. The battlefield roared with chaos, yet all the queen could see was the human standing firm after that single strike. His body shook, his arms weak, but he remained on his feet while enemies fell back in surprise. She had expected fear to swallow him whole, but instead there was fire in his eyes. Not the fire of rage or training, but the fire of survival, of something raw and untamed. For the first time in years, the queen felt her lips curl into something close to a frown. This was not what she had planned. Her generals shouted at her, demanding orders, pulling her attention back to the tide of war. She raised her hand and signaled the charge. Thousands of armored warriors pushed forward, their banners cutting through smoke. The queen's voice rang like thunder as she ordered her people to strike harder, faster. Yet even as she commanded, her gaze kept drifting back to the human. Elias was surrounded by battle, yet he moved differently from the rest. He was slower, unskilled, clumsy, but each motion carried a strange weight. When he swung his sword, it was not elegant, but it was final. Each desperate strike sent enemies sprawling. Elias himself felt no pride in what he had done. His arms burned with pain, and his legs trembled beneath him. Every heartbeat screamed that he did not belong here. He had never been trained to fight, never raised in the halls of warriors. Back home he had been a simple man, living a simple life. Yet when the spear had aimed for his heart, something inside him had refused to yield. That refusal had carried into his swing, and now he could not stop. Every enemy that came near he met with the same desperate strength. He feared each one, yet he did not run. The Queen's commander, a tall alien with golden armor and scars, across his face had been given the order to watch over the human. At first he thought it a cruel joke, to waste his skill protecting someone who would die within minutes. But now, as he fought beside Elias, he felt something strange. The human's clumsy strikes left gaps and the commander filled them, moving with grace and power. Yet at the same time, Elias's raw blows created openings the commander could use. Without meaning to, the human was shaping the rhythm of their fight. They moved like mismatched pieces, but somehow they fit. The Queen narrowed her eyes as she noticed this. Her alien warriors had trained for decades to fight side by side, to breathe as one on the battlefield. Yet this untrained man had created an unspoken link with her best commander in less than an hour. She told herself it was luck, nothing more. Still, she could not look away. She watched as Elias raised his blade again, sweat dripping from his face, fear in his eyes, but also determination that refused to die. The enemy line began to falter. They had expected the Queen's army to be fierce, but they had not expected a human among them. Whispers spread quickly across the battlefield. Some said the man's strike had carried the blessing of the gods. Others said he was a weapon hidden by the Queen until the right moment. Truth did not matter. Fear was enough to weaken their charge. The Queen's army pushed harder, blades rising and falling like waves against the shore. Elias did not hear the whispers, nor did he see the fear he caused. His world had shrunk to the swing of his sword, the scream of enemies, the pounding of his heart. His body begged him to stop, but his spirit pushed forward. He stumbled, fell to one knee, but rose again, lifting his sword even as his arms shook, like branches in the wind. He fought not for glory, not for honor, but because something deep inside told him he must. When the clash ended, the battlefield was silent, except for the moans of the wounded and the crackle of fire. The Queen stood tall among the ruins of her enemies, her cape stained with dust and ash. She looked again to Elias. He was on his knees, his sword buried in the dirt, his body broken with exhaustion. Yet his eyes still glowed with the same fire. The Queen felt something stir in her chest, something she had not felt in a long time: respect. And with it came a question she did not want to answer. Had she been wrong to call him weak? The night after the battle was filled with the smell of smoke and iron. Fires burned across the ruined plain, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the air. The Queen's army set up camp, their banners planted high to mark victory. Songs of triumph rose from the warriors, but the Queen herself did not join. She sat upon a broken stone pillar, her eyes fixed on the human who rested by the fire. He was no longer holding his sword. It lay in the dirt beside him as if even touching it had become too heavy. His head bowed, his body leaned forward, and sweat clung to his skin like dew. He looked more like a man on the edge of collapse than a warrior who had just changed the course of battle. The Queen's daughters whispered among themselves, their voices sharp and mocking. They said the human had been lucky. They said he would not survive another fight. They laughed that their mother had chosen the weakest of all creatures to fight by their side. The Queen did not stop them, though she did not laugh either. Instead, she watched Elias. His shoulders shook as he breathed, but his eyes did not look defeated. They were tired, yes, but they still burned. That quiet fire unsettled her more than his awkward strength. The commander who had fought beside Elias approached the Queen. He was still armored, his face streaked with blood and dirt, but his voice carried calm. He said the human was different. He said Elias did not fight like a soldier, but he did not fight like a coward either. He fought because he refused to let death take him. And in that refusal, he had created space for others to strike. The queen listened in silence. She knew her commander was not one to waste words. If he spoke well of the human, it meant something. Yet she refused to let admiration show on her face. Elias sat quietly, unaware of the attention he was drawing. His hands ached, his body throbbed with pain, but inside him something had shifted. He had never imagined himself standing in the middle of war. He had never wanted it. Yet when he had faced death, he had felt a strange clarity. He did not think of himself. He thought of the others beside him, the warriors who would fall if he failed. That thought had kept his sword moving when his strength had nearly gone, and though fear still clung to him, a small voice whispered that perhaps he was not as weak as they believed. As the camp settled, the queen rose and walked toward him. Silence followed her steps, and the laughter of her daughters faded. The warriors turned their heads, watching as their queen stopped before the weary human. Elias raised his eyes slowly, unsure what she wanted. She studied him for a long time, her gaze piercing, her face unreadable. At last she spoke. She asked if he had been afraid. Elias did not hesitate. He told her yes, more afraid than he had ever been in his life. But he said fear had not stopped him. It had sharpened him. It had forced him to move. The queen tilted, her head slightly as though she had heard something she did not expect. For a long moment no one spoke. Then she turned and left, her cape trailing behind her. She gave no praise, no scorn, but in her silence something had changed. The army sensed it, though none dared to voice it. Respect was a seed, and it had been planted in the queen's heart, even if she would not admit it. Elias felt the weight of her gaze linger even after she was gone, and for the first time, he wondered if his presence in this war had a meaning greater than survival. That night, as the stars burned cold above the shattered land, Elias dreamed of battles yet to come. He dreamed of standing not as a burden, but as an equal, and though he did not understand why, he felt the eyes of the queen watching him even in his sleep. The next morning dawned with a sky painted in red and gold, the sun rising over the battlefield that still carried the scent of blood. The queen stood at the edge of the camp, her cloak whipping in the cold wind while her generals reported their victories. They spoke of enemies crushed, cities taken, and the fear spreading through rival kingdoms. She listened, her face calm, but her thoughts kept drifting to the human. He had risen early despite his wounds, sitting quietly with his sword across his lap, as if trying to understand the weight of it. His movements were stiff, clumsy, yet there was no sign of retreat. He looked like a man who had chosen to endure. The queen's daughters sneered as they passed him, tossing sharp words his way. They told him he would fall in the next battle. They told him he had no place among true warriors. Elias did not answer. He lowered his eyes, his silence more cutting than any response. The commander, who had stood beside him in battle, noticed this. He told the daughters that words meant little when blades had already spoken. They glared at him, but they said nothing more. Even they had seen the strike that had shaken the battlefield. Later, as the army prepared to march again, the queen called Elias before her. The soldiers watched with curiosity, wondering if she would dismiss him or humiliate him further. Instead, she asked him a question that none expected. She asked why he had not run. His answer came softly, but it carried across the camp. He said he had thought about it. When the first spear came for him, every part of him wanted to flee. But he remembered the faces around him, the warriors who fought with everything they had. He could not run and let them fall. His voice did not rise, but the quiet strength in it silenced even those who doubted him. The queen studied him closely. His words were not the polished phrases of generals. They were not the proud boasts of heroes. They were simple, but they were honest. She turned away without comment, leaving him to return to his place. But her silence carried weight. The soldiers noticed it, and whispers began to spread again. Perhaps the human was not a joke after all. Perhaps the queen saw something in him that others could not. The march was long, through deserts of broken stone and valleys where the wind howled like spirits of the dead. The queen rode at the front, her presence unshaken. Elias walked among the foot soldiers, his armor heavy on his frame. He stumbled often, but each time he rose again. His hands blistered from holding the sword, yet he never loosened his grip. The others began to watch him differently. They no longer laughed at his stumbles. Some even offered him water or shared quiet nods of respect. They had seen many strong warriors fall without honor, but this human refused to yield. At night, when the campfires glowed, Elias trained in silence. His swings were awkward, his stances poor, but he practiced again and again. The commander sometimes joined him, correcting his posture, showing him how to move his feet. The queen often passed by unseen in the shadows, watching him struggle. She wondered why he did not rest like the others. He had already proven more than expected, yet still he pushed himself. She felt a strange pull, an unwilling respect that grew stronger with each day. By the time the next battle neared, the army no longer saw Elias as a burden. He was still weak compared to them, still untrained, but he carried himself differently. He walked with quiet purpose, as though he had accepted the path laid before him. And though the queen told herself he was still the weakest partner she had ever chosen, a part of her could not forget the moment his strike had shaken her heart. That part now whispered louder each day. The drums of war echoed again. Scouts returned with word that the enemy had gathered their strongest warriors, preparing to strike in full force. The queen stood before her army, her armor gleaming like fire under the morning light. She raised, her hand commanding silence, and her voice rang out with power. She spoke of victory, of blood, of the empire's strength. The soldiers roared back, their voices shaking the ground. Yet in the midst of that thunder, Elias stood quietly, gripping his sword with trembling hands. His fear was real, but so was the steady resolve that had carried him this far. The enemy came swift and merciless. Arrows darkened the sky, and shields rose to block them. Spears clashed against armor, and the battlefield became a storm of chaos. The queen cut through foes with grace and fury, her cape whipping as her blade flashed. Her daughters fought beside her, fierce and untouchable, yet her eyes searched for the human even as she struck down her enemies. She wanted to see if he would still stand when death came close again. Elias moved awkwardly through the battlefield, his strikes heavy and raw. He was no match in skill, but his will gave his blade weight. Each swing carried desperation, and desperation made him dangerous. Enemies underestimated him, thinking him an easy kill, only to find themselves crushed beneath his clumsy power. Still, he staggered, his arms aching, his breaths ragged. Each strike cost him dearly, but he refused to stop. The commander stayed near, covering his weaknesses, and together they fought as if bound by an unseen thread. Then came the moment that would test him more than any before. From the enemy's side, a beast emerged, towering above the soldiers. It was covered in dark armor, its eyes burning with cruel light. Its roar shook the battlefield, scattering warriors from both sides. The queen herself turned her gaze upon it, her lips curling in disdain. She prepared to face it, but the beast's path cut straight toward Elias. The crowd shouted warnings, voices lost in the storm of war. Elias froze as the ground trembled beneath its steps, fear rooting him to the earth. The commander rushed forward, striking at the beast, but its massive claw sent him crashing into the dirt. Elias stood alone, his sword shaking in his hand. The beast raised its weapon high, ready to crush him. Every part of him screamed to run. His legs wanted to flee, his heart thundered with terror. But then he remembered the queen's question. He remembered telling her he had been afraid but had not let fear stop him, and in that moment he chose again. He gripped the sword with both hands and stepped forward. The beast struck, its blow powerful enough to shatter stone. Elias raised his blade, expecting to die. The impact rattled his bones, nearly drove him into the ground. Yet something inside him refused to break. He shouted, a raw cry that tore from his chest, and pushed back with everything he had. The sword trembled, sparks flying, but it did not shatter. With one final surge, Elias twisted his body and swung. The blade cut deep into the beast's side, not with skill but with force born of desperation. The beast howled, stumbling backward, its armor cracked. The battlefield froze for a heartbeat. Soldiers watched in disbelief as the human who had been called weak stood over a wounded beast. Elias's arms shook violently, his strength nearly gone, but his eyes blazed with defiance. The queen's heart pounded as she watched. She had seen many warriors face fear, but few had conquered it. The strike might have been clumsy, but it carried the weight of something greater. The beast roared again, rising for another attack, and the queen moved then, her blade flashing as she joined the fight at his side. Together, queen and human struck as one. Her blade was swift, his heavy, and the two combined forced the beast down at last. When it fell, the earth shook with its death. The queen stood over its body, her breath steady, her eyes sharp. Elias collapsed to his knees, his sword slipping from his grip. Yet even in exhaustion, his gaze lifted to meet hers. For the first time, she did not see weakness in him. She saw something else, a partner who refused to break, no matter the odds, and though she would not admit it aloud, her heart stirred with a feeling she could not name. The beast's corpse still smoked when the queen called for the march to halt. Her army gathered in silence, their eyes darting again and again toward the human who had stood his ground. None laughed now. The whispers were different, heavier, carrying words like fate and omen. Elias sat near the fire as healers tended to his cuts and bruises, though his spirit seemed untouched. His hands trembled when they washed away the blood, but his eyes remained calm. He had not expected to live, yet here he was, breathing, alive, stronger than before. The queen stood apart, her gaze locked on him. Something inside her had shifted during that battle. She had fought beside many warriors, but never beside one like him. His movements were unskilled, his strikes ugly, yet they carried a weight that no training could teach. She told herself it was chance, nothing more. But the thought repeated like a whisper in her mind. What if it was not chance? What if the human carried something her kind had long forgotten? That night, she summoned him to her tent. The guards looked uneasy, unsure what their queen intended. Elias stepped inside, still sore from the battle, bowing his head as he stood before her. She studied him in the glow of torchlight, her eyes cold yet curious. She asked him if he understood what he had done. Elias shook his head. He said he had only swung his sword because he had no choice. He admitted he was terrified, that his body wanted to collapse, but he could not let himself stop. His words were plain, but there was honesty in them, and honesty carried power. The queen leaned forward, her voice lower. She told him that fear was a weapon. It could break a man, or it could sharpen him. Most warriors claimed to fight without fear, but she had always known better. Fear lived in everyone, yet this human had taken fear and made it into strength. She did not praise him outright, but her words carried something he had not expected. Recognition. For Elias, it was strange to stand before a queen who could kill with a look and hear that she did not see only weakness in him anymore. The next day, she tested him. Without warning, she commanded her daughters to spar with him. They were fierce, skilled, and merciless. Elias was given no time to prepare. His sword clashed against theirs, his arms burning, his feet stumbling on the dirt. The daughters struck, again and again, laughing as they pushed him back. Yet each time he fell, he rose. Each time his sword slipped, he caught it again. Sweat poured down his face, but he never begged for mercy. The queen watched closely, her expression unreadable. She wanted to see where he would break, and yet he did not. By the end of the sparring, Elias collapsed to his knees, too weak to lift his sword. The daughters sneered, declaring him unfit. But the queen raised her hand, silencing them. She told them he had endured what many of her warriors could not. He had stood against them longer than anyone expected. Her daughters argued, saying he was still clumsy, still slow. The queen agreed, but then added something that froze them. She said he had something they lacked. Endurance born not of training, but of will. Elias listened quietly, too exhausted to speak. For him, every strike had felt like the end. but he had risen because something inside refused to yield. He did not know why the queen tested him, but he sensed she was no longer mocking him. She was measuring him, weighing him as if he was more than a burden. That thought filled him with both fear and strange pride. As the camp settled again, the queen stood alone, her eyes on the stars. She told herself the human was still the weakest partner she could have chosen. Yet each day, that truth felt less certain. Each strike, each stumble, each rise left its mark. And though she did not speak, she began to wonder if fate had placed him in her path for a reason she had yet to see. The days that followed brought no peace. Scouts reported that the enemy had changed their movements, striking quicker, testing the queen's borders. The war was shifting, and her army needed new strategies to survive. The queen gathered her generals in the command tent, their voices sharp as they argued over maps and markers. They debated where to march, which passes to block, and which cities to defend. Elias sat outside the tent, cleaning his battered sword with quiet care. He had no place among the voices of strategy, or so he thought. But when the arguing grew, heated, the queen's voice cut through. She ordered Elias to enter. The generals stared at him in disbelief, some openly sneering. They whispered that he was no warrior, no tactician. Yet the queen silenced them with a look. She asked Elias what he saw when he looked at the map. He hesitated, unsure if she was testing him again, but her eyes told him to speak. Slowly he traced the lines of mountains and rivers. He pointed to a narrow valley where the enemy had gathered. He said if they pushed there, they would trap themselves, unable to move quickly or retreat. His words were simple, without the polish of soldiers trained in war. But they carried a strange clarity. The tent fell quiet. One general scoffed, saying the human spoke like a farmer looking at fields. But another paused, frowning as he studied the map. He admitted the human was right. The valley would indeed be a trap if the queen's army struck at the right time. The queen's eyes narrowed. She had expected little, yet Elias had seen something her generals had overlooked. She gave the order. The army would march to the valley. When the battle came, it unfolded as Elias had predicted. The enemy poured into the narrow pass, their numbers vast, their banners filling the sky. But the queen's army struck from above, raining down fury from the cliffs. The enemy's size became their weakness, their movements slowed by the tight space. Panic spread through their ranks as the queen's warriors cut them down. From his place among the soldiers, Elias saw it all. For the first time, he understood that war was not only strength of arms, but also strength of thought. After victory, the queen summoned him again. She asked how he had seen what her generals had missed. Elias answered simply. He said he had grown, up on lands where storms flooded the fields, where rivers cut through soil, and where a single wrong step could ruin a harvest. He said he had learned to see how the land itself could destroy those who did not respect it. To him, the valley had looked not like a battlefield, but like a field ready to swallow those who walked carelessly into it. His voice carried no pride, only truth. The queen studied him for a long time, saying nothing, though something in her eyes softened. The generals were less silent. Some resented the human even more, ashamed that he had seen what they had not. Others began to watch him differently, wondering if perhaps the queen had chosen wisely. The soldiers whispered again, their tales of him growing larger. They no longer called him weak. They called him strange, unpredictable, even dangerous in ways they did not understand. And though Elias did not seek their praise, he felt the shift in the air around him. At night, the queen stood by her fire thinking. She had given him the weakest sword, the smallest place, expecting him to fail. Yet each battle proved otherwise. He did not fight with skill, but with will. He did not lead with pride, but with sight born of experience no warrior had considered valuable. She told herself it was still not enough. He was still untrained, still clumsy. Yet each time she tried to dismiss him, his image rose before her again. The human who refused to yield, the man who had turned fear into strength, and now perhaps something more. Word of the valley victory spread faster than the army's march. Messengers carried tales to distant courts, and rumors grew wilder with each retelling. Some said the queen had found a weapon no one could stop. Others whispered that she had taken a weakling as her partner, shaming her throne. By the time her army reached the capital, the palace halls were alive with murmurs. Nobles and advisors lined the throne room, their eyes sharp, their tongues ready. They bowed to her with practiced grace, but their whispers cut like blades. They demanded to know why a human, a man who had never held a sword before this war, now stood so close to her command. The queen sat tall on her throne, her armor polished, her gaze unyielding. Elias stood behind her, silent, feeling the weight of every eye. He had never known such halls, never stood under ceilings carved with gold and stone. He felt small, out of place, yet he did not lower his head. The nobles called him unworthy, a danger, even a curse. One stepped forward boldly, saying the queen risked the empire's honor by keeping him at her side. The hall grew tense, waiting for her to strike down the insult. But she did not. Instead, she asked Elias to step forward. The crowd erupted in outrage, but the queen's hand silenced them. She asked him in front of all why he still fought. Elias's answer was the same as before. He said he was afraid, always afraid, but he would not run. He said he fought because he would not let those beside him fall if he could stand in their place. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the hall. There was no pride in it, only honesty. And honesty has a way of sinking deeper than polished lies. Some nobles shifted uncomfortably, others sneered, but none could deny the weight of his words. Still, the court pressed harder. They said a throne could not be defended by a man who stumbled with every step. They warned that enemies would see his presence as weakness, not strength. The queen's daughters spoke too, their voices sharp, saying the human was not fit to stand in their ranks. For a long moment, the queen was silent. Then she rose, her voice cutting through the chamber like steel. She said her people had trained for centuries, yet it was the human's strike that had broken the enemy beast. It was his eyes that had seen the valley's trap. She told them she valued strength, yes, but she valued endurance even more, and this human had endured where many would have fallen. Her words silenced the court, though the tension did not fade. Some bowed their heads, unwilling to argue further. Others burned with anger, plotting in silence. Elias stood quietly, unsure if he had helped her cause or made it harder. Yet when her hand brushed the air, commanding him back to her side, he felt something he could not name, a belonging, fragile but real. That night, the queen walked alone on the palace balcony. Her eyes on the city below, the torches of her people glowed like stars scattered on earth. She thought of the battles fought, the doubts faced, the whispers that chased her every step. She had ruled through strength, through fear, through glory. Yet now beside her stood a man who had none of those, and still he shifted the tide. She wondered if fate mocked her or if it had given her something greater than she could yet see. Elias, alone in his chamber, traced the edge of his sword with calloused fingers. He thought of the queen's words in the hall, the way her voice had defended him. He knew many still hated him, many still wanted him gone, but for the first time, he believed he was not standing in her shadow. He was standing beside her, even if the world refused to see it. The storm of war returned before the court's whispers could fade. Messengers arrived breathless, their armor streaked with dust. The enemy had rallied, gathering their might for one final strike. They were coming not for land, but for the queen herself. Their generals had sworn to break her throne, to drag her banners through the mud. The queen listened in silence, her jaw set, her hand resting on the hilt of her blade. Around her, advisors argued, some warning that she could not risk another battle so soon. Others whispered that it was the human's presence that had stirred such boldness in her foes. The queen silenced them all. She declared she would meet the enemy in open battle. Her voice carried through the hall strong and steady. The soldiers roared their loyalty, but beneath the cheers fear lurked. The enemy was vast, and their numbers dwarfed her own. Still, She turned her eyes toward Elias, who stood quietly at her side. She did not speak to him, yet in that glance she gave him a burden greater than words. He felt it settle on his shoulders like iron. He had been chosen again, not as a pawn, but as something more. The march to the battlefield was long and heavy. The sky turned dark with storm clouds, as though the heavens themselves prepared to watch. The queen rode at the front, her cape flowing, her armor glowing in flashes of lightning. Elias walked among the soldiers, his sword strapped to his back. He could hear the whispers around him. Some still doubted, some still cursed his name. But others, quieter, spoke of the beast he had struck down, of the valley he had foreseen. Those whispers gave him strength when his legs threatened to falter. The enemy awaited them on the plains, their banners stretching farther than the eye could see. Their warriors pounded their weapons against their shields, the sound rolling like thunder. At the center stood their champion, a towering figure clad in black steel, his eyes burning with hatred for the queen. He raised his voice across the plain, mocking her, calling her weak for fighting beside a human. His words carried like poison, reaching every soldier. Some of the queen's warriors shifted uneasily, their faith trembling. The queen stepped forward, her voice clear and sharp. She did not deny the human's presence. Instead, she lifted her blade and declared that weakness was not measured in blood or skill, but in surrender. She said her partner had not surrendered, and for that reason, he stood as proof of strength, greater than any crown. Her words struck like fire, rallying her army, but the enemy only laughed. Their champion challenged her openly, demanding combat that would decide the fate of both sides. The queen accepted. The battlefield fell silent as the two armies stepped back, forming a vast circle of waiting eyes. The champion strode forward, his black blade humming with power. The queen advanced to meet him, her movements graceful and deadly. Elias stood at the edge of the circle, his fists clenched. He wanted to fight at her side, but the law of challenge allowed no partner. Still, his heart pounded as if he were in the ring himself. The clash shook the earth. The queen's blade danced, meeting strike after strike, sparks flying into the storm-dark sky. The champion's strength was monstrous, his blows cracking the ground, yet she held her ground, her movements precise. The crowd roared with every strike, soldiers crying out for their queen. Elias's chest burned with helplessness as he watched. Every time she staggered, every time the champion pressed closer, he felt as if the blade aimed for her was aimed for him. The duel raged, but at last the queen faltered. A misstep, small but real, gave the champion his chance. His blade struck hard, sending her crashing to the ground. Gasps filled the circle, hope faltering. The champion raised his weapon high, ready to end her life. Elias did not think. His legs moved before his mind could stop them. He stepped into the circle, sword drawn, his voice a raw cry. The law forbade interference, but his heart did not care. He would not watch her fall. The armies shouted in outrage, but Elias stood between the champion and the queen, his blade trembling in his grip. The queen lifted her head, shock in her eyes. For the first time, Elias's fear burned into something greater. Not survival, not desperation, but defiance. He was no longer fighting for himself. He was fighting for her. The battlefield erupted in chaos the moment Elias stepped into the circle. Soldiers on both sides shouted in rage, calling him a dishonor, a thief of the queen's duel. Yet the champion in black steel only laughed, his booming voice mocking the human who dared to stand in his way. Elias's hands shook as he raised, his sword the weight almost too much for his weary arms. He knew the law forbade him to interfere, but he also knew something deeper. If he stood back and watched her die, nothing else would matter. The queen rose slowly behind him, blood on her lips, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had never expected him to break the rules, to risk his life and honor so recklessly. Yet there, he stood, his body trembling, his sword clumsy but his stance unbroken. She wanted to order him back, but the words caught in her throat. For the first time in her long reign, someone had chosen her, not her crown, not her empire, her. The champion struck first. His blade came down like thunder, and Elias barely managed to raise his own. The impact rattled his bones, forcing him to his knees. Pain shot through his arms, but he gritted his teeth, refusing to drop the weapon. The champion pressed harder, sneering, calling him weak, calling him nothing. Elias shouted back, his voice raw, saying weakness was running, and he would never run again. With a surge of strength, he twisted his body and forced the champion back a single step. It was small, but it shook the circle as much as any victory. The queen's eyes widened. She saw it then. His body was broken, his skill poor, but his will was indestructible. She rose, staggering, but her hand gripped her own sword once more. She moved beside him, her voice cutting across the silence. She declared that if the enemy wanted her throne, they would have to face not just a queen, but the partner fate had placed at her side. Together they fought. The champion struck again and again, his power monstrous, but for every blow, Elias stood firm, his raw strength meeting the force head-on. His blade swung awkwardly, but each strike carried the weight of his refusal to yield. The queen's movements were sharp and precise, weaving around his power like fire around stone. They moved as mismatched halves that somehow fit, her skill and his will, her speed and his weight. The champion faltered. He had expected an easy kill, but the human would not fall. He grew reckless, his swings wider, his rage louder. That was when Elias found the opening. It was not skill that guided his strike, but instinct, the same instinct that had carried him through every battle before. He raised his sword high and brought it down with all the force left in his body. The blade cracked against the champion's armor, shattering it like glass. The giant roared in pain, stumbling back. The queen moved, in that instant her sword flashing with deadly precision. She struck true, and the champion fell, his black steel scattering across the dirt. Silence held the battlefield for a single heartbeat. Then the queen raised her sword high, declaring victory. The army erupted in a roar that shook the plains, their voices crying her name and his. For the first time they shouted the human's name as one of their own. Elias collapsed to the ground, his strength gone, his chest heaving. The queen knelt beside him, her hand gripping his shoulder. For a moment her fierce mask broke and her voice softened so only he could hear. She told him he had done what none had ever done before. He had shaken her heart. He had stood where no one else dared, and though she would never call him weak again, she whispered that his greatest strength was not in his sword, but in the fire that refused to die within him. That night, when the fires of victory burned high and songs filled the air, the queen stood before her people with Elias at her side. She declared him not her burden, not her shame, but her partner. And as the cheers rose into the stormy sky, Elias looked at the sword in his hand, no longer heavy, no longer foreign. For the first time he believed it truly belonged to him,